Firstly, thank you for having me. To echo what Adam said, I've been following the story of Horton since its inception, so it's amazing to see it as the business it is today and to be here with you. Like Adam said, I have run a podcast where I've basically shared the life lessons I wish I knew sooner for the past 5 years. I'll get into that in a minute, but for you to understand why I'm here and why some of these lessons make sense to me and hopefully in part to you, we kind of need to retrace the past 14 years. Now, there's nothing I hate more than somebody who delivers a talk and just talks about themselves, right? There's zero value in that. So I've tried to get this down to the briefest period possible, but this context, I believe, is important. And the past 14 years is kind of a story of these three guys here. And you can't really see it on the screen because it's quite bright in here. But there's this little guy here, who is me. There's this little guy in a big suit here, which is me. And there's this very drunk guy over on the right, which is also me. And that first guy on the left, in the funny looking shirt, his story begins here with a business called Corby magazine. Now, when I was 14, I lived in Corby, which of course isn't far from here, and my friend and I, Lewis, we realized that we didn't really like education, we didn't really like school, but we both had an interest in business, and we were both really proud of the town that we were from. Corby, at the time at least, had a very, very bad reputation. It was very run down. This was before all of the redevelopment. And I went to a school where there were kind of half the kids were from Corby, half the kids were from the surrounding villages. And so if you were from Corby, you kind of had this bad press. So we wanted to make the case for Corby being good and all the redevelopment. So we came up with the creatively named Corby magazine. It's a very simple business model. We put advertisers in a magazine. We printed that with the money that they gave us. We distributed that for free. And we made a little bit of money. And I'll be honest, it's probably the wealthiest I've ever felt, right? Because I was 14 years old, I was below the age where it was necessary to pay tax, and I was making a few grand per issue with no bills. So I felt incredibly wealthy. And then things shot off very quickly. One thing that didn't shoot off is my height. I am a lot taller than that now. But we bumped into a guy called Ian, who was a PR guy, and very long story short, he thought that we had a story, so he pitched it to like the local newspaper, and then the radio stations picks up on it, and then the regional, so this is BBC Look East, and then a few weeks later we get a call from a London number, and they wanted us to go on to the BBC main website, the business news, and then we were on BBC Breakfast News, and this clip here is me telling Rupert Murdoch to watch out, which still haunts me because it's just awkward. So we had this business which felt like it was going very well, right? We were making a lot of money for our age. We were getting this national and international acclaim. There was a newspaper in France who made an app about us, like just about us. That's the times we were living in back then. It was crazy. But then this guy on the left had a bit of a wake-up call because the person stood next to me, still a good friend of mine today, Lewis, he moved to London. So GCSEs happened, Lewis moved to London, and so Corby magazine came to an end. And so I was a lost and confused 16-year-old who had an interest in business, but at the time didn't have a business. So I did what any lost and confused 16-year-old budding entrepreneur would do, and I applied to go on the BBC's Young Apprentice. And that's kind of where this second picture comes in, where I am very shy, very unconfident. I'm in the middle of this big, scary situation with cameras everywhere, with producers everywhere. And I thought that I was the guy, right? From this version of me over here who knew what I was doing with business, I thought that I would walk it would be a doddle, but actually things got very real very quickly. And there's not much to tell you about The Apprentice because it was a very brief period of my life. Here's what you need to know. I went on to the Young Apprentice, having just ran a publishing business, and I got fired by Lord Sugar on a publishing task. So I did the logical thing, and I started another publishing business. This time it was called Magnate, and it was the exact same business model as Corby magazine. It was just scaled up. There was more copies being printed, there was more money involved, and we were working with some bigger brands. And this time it was in London. And we were reaching somewhere close to 60,000 people per month between the print publication and the online publication. And we interviewed some really, really interesting people. So we were fortunate enough to launch with a cover interview with Sir Richard Branson. We had Jamie Lang, we had Wretch Free 2, we had Conor Maynard, who I promise was relevant back then. He was the guy. So we had the chance to interview some really interesting and some really intelligent people, and this guy. And so we did 4 issues and then 2 years online, reaching hundreds of thousands of people, working with some big international brands. And so that's the guy on the right, because with all of that going on, when I was 20, the parties with the people from Made in Chelsea, the endless free drinks, the exciting opportunities to post on the internet what I was doing without actually backing it up with substance, I almost turned into this kind of parody of myself, right? I was doing everything I could to be perceived to be doing without actually doing the work. And funny enough, Peter over there and Adam, wherever he's gone, that's how we met. So we all met at a talk that Peter hosted maybe a decade ago in Lincoln, and Peter had seen Public Sean, right? Peter had seen the version who looked like he knows what he was doing. And then I rocked up to give this talk, and it was the fucking worst talk I've ever given in my life. It was so bad, because I had nothing to say, right? Because there was this persona that I had built, and then when I stood up to speak about what I was doing, there was nothing there because it wasn't backed with substance. So things happened, Magnate came to an end, and then that was going to be a joke about Young Apprentice, but I missed the punchline, so we'll move on. And now I run a business called Patter. We're a business growth consultancy agency. We help brands find solutions to their most pressing growth challenges. The reason I show you these three people is because at each period of my life back then, prior to where I'm at right now, in some way I thought I knew what I was doing, right? I was the 14-year-old getting all of the press coverage in the country for being this exciting young entrepreneur. I was this 16-year-old guy on national TV, sat in front of Lord Sugar with all of my peers thinking that was incredible. I was the 21-year-old guy going to the parties and getting the free bars and on Instagram looking like I was living the life. But I reached a point where I realized, perhaps around the age of 22 or 23, that I didn't know who I was and I didn't know where I was going. And despite the best part of a decade that had come previous, where I thought that I was going in the right direction, I was very lost in my early 20s and I had nothing going for me. And so around that time, I launched the podcast that Adam mentioned, and now for the past 5 years and 250 episodes, I've been sharing the life lessons I wish I knew sooner, sometimes on my own and sometimes joined by guests, such as Billy over there was my first ever guest, so thank you for taking a chance on me. And so what I hope to do today is just share 8 of those lessons that I've learned over the past 5 or 6 years, 8 which I think are the most useful for everybody sat in here, because there's something I've learned over those years, which is you can learn a lesson once, but it's almost like every 6 months you need to learn the same lesson, right? The advice that you need to hear today is the exact same advice that you needed to hear 10 years ago, in the exact same way that the advice that I'm going to share here today is the exact advice that the guy on the left, the 14-year-old Sean, needed to hear 14 years ago. And the first of those lessons is that progress hardly ever looks exciting. Now, for the best part of a decade of my life, I fell into the trap that I think many people fall into, of assuming that to be making progress in your life privately, it needs to look publicly like you are making progress, right? And I won't ask you to name somebody, but we can all probably think of a friend or somebody we went to school with who we have on Instagram right now who looks incredibly successful, right? They have the Rolex and the amazing car and the big house, and they're going on holiday 7 times a year, and it looks like they're making progress. But I promise you, and you probably know this already, if you pull back the curtain on their life, they are probably those who are stagnating most, because they're focusing not on actually making progress. They're focusing not on actually building themselves into the kind of person they want to be, but rather they're playing the role and they're building this persona, much like I was in my early 20s. And as I was thinking about this lesson and kind of pondering how best to describe the difference between perceived progress and real progress, it took me back to the only thing that I seem to speak about these days, which is running. So I'm trying to run 4 marathons in 4 months at the end of this year. And I was incredibly unfit at the beginning of last year, right? I started Couch to 5K, as everybody does. And if I remember correctly, the first week of Couch to 5K, you have to run for 60 seconds and then walk for 90 seconds, run, walk, right? And that first 60 seconds killed me, right? I still have the Apple Watch data. My heart rate was like 206 BPM from running for 60 seconds. Like, it was a problem. And progress did not feel good. It did not look exciting in that moment, right? It actually looked really embarrassing. The fact that I had to, because I was posting it to the internet at the time to try and get donations for the half marathon I was doing, the fact that I had to say to everybody who follows me and everybody I've ever met, like, I'm so incredibly unfit and I have made such little progress in my health up until this point in life that I can't run for 60 seconds without basically being in hospital. That didn't look exciting. And I promise you that every run since then has not felt exciting. It has not felt like I'm making progress. And yet 2 weeks on Sunday will be the first marathon, and the progress I've made since, the 20-mile run I did last week, the kind of training that I have done up until this point, is the unexciting work which is required to get across the finish line, right? And it's a perfect metaphor, and all of you know this in your businesses and in your lives already. The kind of public victories that you celebrate once a year, once every 2 years, the big thing that you can shout about, never comes from trying to shortcut that process. It never comes from trying to show people too soon, to jump the gun and make it look like you're making progress, because there's almost these two competing forces, right? There is the force of actually just locking yourself away and doing the work and doing the boring, consistent action for days and weeks and months and years, as Adam said that I like to do so much, right? I am just blindly consistent in everything I do, and it looks really boring. And your friends are like, what are you doing? Why don't you come out and party? Why don't you do this or do that? Or like, come to Ibiza this year. And then there's the showing it off, which looks like progress, but it's almost like every time you show it off, every time you try and make progress look or feel exciting, you're cashing that check and restarting at zero. And I honestly would have saved 5 or 6 years of my life if I had just understood the very simple concept that progress hardly ever looks exciting. And so if you're in a period of your life right now where you're being consistent and you almost feel like you're languishing, right? You're stuck a little bit, but you're just plodding along, and that feels wrong, and that feels like it's not the right thing to be doing, then I believe at least that that is a signal that you're doing the exact thing you should be doing. If it feels boring, nobody else is going to do it. If it feels cumbersome, that's a moat you're building between you and everybody else who can't be bothered doing that boring work because they're looking for the exciting Instagram post. And so on this idea, I would say that if your progress feels boring, keep going. The second one, now this is a little bit more practical, but this has been massive for me this year. So I learned this lesson, I believe there's also a book of the same name, Ask Who, Not How. I didn't know this until very recently. But I learned this lesson from a guest on the podcast a couple of years ago, Paul Mort. Very interesting guy, author, life coach, based up in the Northeast, very sweary, very to the point. And he was on my podcast, and I asked him at the end of, I think, 2022, what was the biggest lesson that he had taken away from that previous year of life. And he gave me this lesson. He said, when you're faced with a challenge, don't ask how do I do it, ask who has already done it before, right? And I kind of, in the edit, listened to that, cool, upload it, ignored it for a year, didn't even think of it. And then at the very end of last year, when I was planning my goals for this year and trying to work out what it is I want to do and how I'm going to go about unlocking some of the silly goals, frankly, that I have before the end of this year, it struck me that I already have the answers, right? Not because I am some kind of font of wisdom who knows everything, but because I have a phone book full of people who are all incredible in their own right, a phone book full of people who have done the things that I one day aspired to do and are more than happy to share the answers. And so at the beginning of this year, alongside the kind of list of challenges that I have for myself this year, I set myself the task of at least once per month, just getting on a video call with somebody who has already done the thing I wish to do, whether it's the guy who's in charge of all of the content at Acast, which is the biggest podcasting platform in the country. I got on a call with him and I'm like, look, my podcast isn't really growing. What can I do about this? And for like 45 minutes at no cost, just because he's a good person, he told me the step-by-step playbook of how you grow a podcast using the data that they have from the biggest podcast in the country. I want to get into speaking in schools more, right? So I spoke to 2 guys who have a big education company and they go into schools. And for like 2 hours, they sat with me on this call and they just told me step by step exactly how you do it. I'm trying to get a publishing deal on a book this or next year. So I spoke to 2 published authors who have taken very different avenues to get there. And it's really hard, I think, in this day and age, particularly if you're a go-getter who is perceived to be somebody who is competent and knows what they're doing, to admit, particularly to those you respect, that in certain domains you have no idea, right? It's really hard to do that. It's really hard to be like, look, mate, I need to do a call on XYZ thing because I am clueless. I am so unqualified on this thing and I had this big aspiration, but frankly, I don't know how to do that. And like, sure, you could be you could lock yourself away and spend 5 years learning the exact process of how to do it so that you can stand up and say that you're self-made, and that's all well and good. But actually, what I've learned, at least as I've grown up and matured and hopefully have become more efficient at actually making progress rather than just spinning my wheels and feeling like I'm doing work, is that the answers to every question you have, whether it's very niche in your domain of a state agency, whether it's to do with your health and fitness, whether it's your finances, whether it's, I don't know, you want to learn to play piano, right? Someone in your phone book already knows. And it's such a easy to overlook idea that next time you're faced with a challenge, don't ask, how do I do this? Ask, who do I know who already can? Third one, now this is a big one, because boy, do I have self-doubt. Hard work negates self-doubt. So there have been an almost endless list of chapters in my life where I am moving on to something new and I don't quite feel that I am in the position to move on yet, right? It's the kind of classic imposter syndrome that we all speak about, that we all know. But I've learned something over the past few years, which is that by virtue of the fact that I'm about to move into that chapter, I'm being blinded by the sun, I hope it moves soon. By virtue of the fact that I'm about to move into that chapter, the work has been done to get me there, right? And so there's a story I told last time I was in Loughborough, funnily enough. I gave a talk to the people at, is it Neighbourhood? Is that what they're called? Our Neighbourhood, amazing. So I was giving this talk and I basically winged it on the day because I had literally just landed back from New York and I was incredibly jet lagged. And I told this story about how years and years and years ago, there's context here that I don't have time to give you, but basically I grew up in a not very well off background, and I would look out of the window of my brother's bedroom when he was on nights out or wherever he was, and I was this like 10-year-old guy, and I'd look at planes in the sky, and I didn't understand how people got on planes. Like, that sounds silly, right? Because of course I knew that an airport existed, but like conceptually I couldn't bridge the gap in my mind of how could somebody ever possibly make enough money to get on one of those things up there that fly past our house, because we certainly weren't going on holiday anywhere other than maybe Skegness once every 3 years, right? So conceptually getting on a plane seemed mad. But then of course fast forward, I don't know, what was it, 18 years since that point, and last time I was in Loughborough, I just landed back from a 10-day trip to New York where we're working with a really exciting fashion brand out there doing a consultancy piece for their business. And if you were to have told 10-year-old Sean, the guy who would stare at planes and wonder how you get on them, that somebody would pay me tens of thousands of pounds to get on a plane and go and advise their enormous 100-year-old business on how to grow, I would think that's crazy. Like, I would be so plagued with self-doubt. And yet, when we stepped into that boardroom just off of Times Square in New York and met with this incredibly distinguished team of fashion executives who knew exactly what they were talking about, I felt entirely comfortable. Not because I had kind of done some sort of manifestation or stared in a mirror and made myself feel good, but because I had done the hard work, right? An incredible amount of hard work happened between 10-year-old Sean staring at the planes and 14-year-old Sean who was starting his first business, and 16-year-old Sean who showed himself up on TV, and the guy who was a bit lost, and the version that you see in front of yourself today. And so in any moment when I feel self-doubt, unless it's genuinely something dumb, right? Like if I was on the top of a skateboard ramp on a skateboard right now and I'm like, oh, I feel a bit unsure of course I do, because I can't fucking skateboard, right? But in most situations that you find yourself in when you feel self-doubt, realizing that the only reason you have the privilege of feeling that way in the first place is because you've probably done years or decades worth of work to get there, and reminding yourself that you're there for a reason regardless of how you feel is so important. So there's this idea that, I can't remember who said it, someone said it, that identity lags behind reality by 1 to 2 years. Chris Williamson on Modern Wisdom always speaks about this idea, but it's not his idea. Basically this idea that where you're at right now, physically, like your actual place in life, is different to how you currently perceive yourself. It takes a couple of years for your identity to catch up with yourself, right? So it's a classic story of the person who was incredibly overweight and then they did amazing weight loss transformation and now they're skinny and they're perhaps rightly or wrongly perceived by the world differently, but in their mind they still feel like that previous version of themselves and they don't yet feel valid or warranted in the praise they get. That kind of idea is true with the work you do as well. So all of us are going to feel like we're not there yet, and all of us are going to feel like we're not ready, but that isn't always necessarily true. And so I find it so useful in these situations when I'm about to sit down with a guest who I've admired for years, when I'm about to step into a boardroom and looking about 14, advise these 65-year-old execs who have paid us a lot of money to be there, that regardless of how much self-doubt I feel, it's the work that's got me there, and so things will be okay. I just think that's really powerful. This one's interesting. Most limitations are self-inflicted, because again, I've tried to pick out the lessons that have plagued me for the longest time, and in some ways the lessons that I probably still need to learn, right? Because if you think about your aspirations in life, I'm not actually going to ask you to do this, don't worry, but if you were to like pull out a bit of paper and write down where it is you want to get in life, and you were being like, okay, you're being slightly modest, but you're being quite aspirational, and then you look at that piece of paper, and then you review that in say 45 years on your deathbed, and you had to stick to it exactly, you would probably realize that right now you're playing it incredibly safe, because most of the things you want to do are entirely possible, right? Most of the things that you want to do are well within your reach if only you believe that you could do them. And so the more that I, particularly as I head towards 30 and have this kind of third life crisis, hopefully it's not a midlife crisis, it's definitely not a quarter, we're past that point, of trying to unlock what it is that I actually want to do in life. Realizing that every time I tell myself no, it's normally not based in reality, it's normally not based in fact, it's normally not based in what I can actually do. It's just that I'm deciding to play it safe. And it's so easy for me to sit here and say that, but as a really useful kind of test, every single time you set yourself something new in life, asking whether that's actually like the most aspirational version that you can go for is really useful. There's not much else to say on that one, but it was just a nice segue from the previous, and I think it's really important. Now this one I can go on about for hours, because this is also one that has plagued me. So if you can't read it because it's very dim, it says, those ahead of you are no different to you. And if there was a comma, it would probably say, those ahead of you are no different to you. They're just a decade further ahead, right? Because I don't know about you, but I look at 10 years ago, I would look at people like Peter, right? Peter was just starting out in his career and he was running a very similar business to mine at the time, but he was definitely further ahead. And 5-6 years ago, you had the vlog and the big team and everything was going incredibly well. It still is. That sounded past tense, but you know what I mean. And I would look at Peter and assume that he was just somehow like inherently different to me, right? I could never do the things that he was doing because he's different to me and I'm different to him, and therefore like I may as well not try, is the logical conclusion of that. And without speaking for you, you're almost definitely guilty of this as well, whether you consciously realize it or not. You're forever consuming other people's lives. And I mean, let's put to one side for a moment the fact that most of what you see on the internet is nonsense, but you already know that, right? It's so easy to look at those who are either doing something you already want to do, or doing the same thing as you but better, or doing it in some sort of different way, or they're more confident, or they're more jacked, or whatever it might be, and lazily, easily assume that they're different to you, right? Because if you assume that somebody's different to you, then frankly, as harsh as this sounds, that's just a cop-out. Because if you assume that somebody's different and not just further ahead, then you never have to go down the path that they have gone. Whereas it's far more empowering, I believe, to realize that they're not different to you, they're just a decade ahead, 2 decades ahead, 4 years ahead, whatever it might be, right? And there's a couple of examples that I love here, right? So the first is, and it's not going to surprise a few people in this room to hear me talk about Ed Sheeran, because it's my entire personality to go to his gigs, it seems. But he, for I think 4 years, sofa surfed, played open mic nights, and nobody turned up to his shows, nobody cared, right? And it's so easy for an aspiring musician today to go to Wembley and see him play to 92,000 people and everybody's screaming his songs back to him, right? And he's playing a guitar which is made by one of his brands on a loop pedal made by another one of his brands, and just be like, well, Ed's different to me. Ed's more talented to me, therefore I can never do what he does. And I'm not saying it's entirely realistic for everybody to be selling out stadiums, right? I say as I'm speaking to 20 people. However, the point is that he is no different. He just did those reps. And you know, if you go back, I think it's Jumpers for Goalposts, it's the documentary that Ed made, where he plays the first ever song that he ever recorded. He was like 13 years old. And like, I promise you, anybody in this room, myself included, could sing better than he could back then, right? And when he was 16 and playing local shows that nobody sold out, you could probably text your friends and get more people to turn up to a gig right now. And when he was 20 and living in London and unsigned and sofa surfing and couldn't make any money, well, you know, you're all entrepreneurial people in here. You could probably make 100 quid by doing a gig tonight, and he didn't manage to. So evidently he's not different to you, right? He was just willing to, for the best part of a decade of his life, sacrifice and do the things that were necessary to get to where he is, to now be in a different position. And nobody wants to hear that, right? Everybody wants to hear that it's the overnight success thing. But then we look at people who we think are overnight successes. Has anybody heard of Matt Rife, the comedian? Does the TikToks, big arms, you know the guy. So I made the mistake of assuming that Matt Rife was an overnight success, right? One day I woke up and he was on my TikTok feed and he was rizzing 60-year-old women in the crowd and doing what he does. And I'm like, yo, this guy's an overnight success. He's came from nowhere, because of course in my consciousness, there was a day when he didn't exist and then there was a day when he did exist. Overnight success. But in writing this book that I'm working on, I dug into his story a little bit. And his story is really interesting because he now has Netflix specials. He sold 600,000 tickets to his most recent tour in 2 hours, right? This guy is incredibly successful. But then when you delve back a little bit, he's not different to any other aspiring comedian, right? Everybody who was at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival earlier this month trying to sell those 8 tickets to the little pub, right? He's not different to them. He just turned up for 11 years. 11 years playing shows not only where he wasn't being paid, but where he had to pay to perform. He had to sell 5 tickets just to be allowed into the venue to stand up and make jokes that nobody laughed at for 11 years of his life. That doesn't mean that he's different. It means his actions were different. And when I said I could go on about this one forever, I really could, because at least when I'm in a position where I'm feeling like I'm not the person to go and do the things I want to do, reminding myself of this idea is so powerful, because that simple switch of realizing that those whose lives you look at and those who have the things you want are the exact same as you, with the exact same doubts and limitations and complex backstory and that thing that happened in your family and those financial issues and everything. They're the same as you, they've just been going for longer. That suddenly goes from being kind of envious and angry and bitter about your situation to empowering, because you realize that if they did it, so too can you. And most of us, myself included, don't want to be a big Wham stand-up comedian or Ed Sheeran, so it's good news because the people that we're aspiring to be like are actually way easier to obtain, right? Their lives are way easier to obtain. So this is a really powerful idea, and it's that those who are ahead of you are no different to you, they're just a decade further ahead. Now this one's interesting, and it kind of relies on a chart that you're not going to be able to see, which is a shame. But it's this idea that the danger zone is in the middle. Let me see if I can turn this so you can see it's the least profound chart you've ever seen. It's like a squiggle with a red line, but it will make sense, right? Can I do it without this wobbly table falling over? I'll narrate it for those who can't see. So, the idea that the danger zone is in the middle. So when I look back on even this year, to be honest, there have been ups and downs in this year, as I'm sure there have for you, but the past 5, 6, 7 years of me really trying to do this business thing as an actual adult. The good times are good, obviously. Like, I'm not going to stand here and be one of those people who are like, oh, it's so bad when things are good because you take your eye off the ball. I don't really believe in that, right? When things are good, you should celebrate. You should be happy. You should lean into your accomplishments. The good times are good. But it's also not the case, I don't think, and it'd be interesting to hear if you agree, that the bad times aren't the worst thing for you ever. Because when your back's up against the wall, when shit has really hit the fan, when you need to make payroll and it's like 2 days until it and there's all these spinning plates or whatever it might be, like, you fucking find a way. It's really easy to get shit done when things are bad. When things are so bad and so existential that you really have to lean into it, things are fine. Can you see that chart? Can anyone see that? You all look so confused. You're all like, no, I can't see it. It's a big squiggle, basically. So, starts here, goes up, goes down, goes up, goes down, right? And let's pretend that this is progress. So sometimes in life things are bad, like over there. There's a red box that you maybe can't see. It's the low part of the chart. But I think that it is this section here which is the most dangerous. It's in the months where, show my lack of knowledge of estate agency here, right? You've got just enough listings to pay your bills and do whatever it is you want to do, and you're kind of growing. It's in the periods of your life where you're, I don't know, showing up to the gym and kind of just doing the sets and reps but not really pushing yourself. It's in the periods where things are comfortable enough for you to become complacent and for you to think that you're cruising and that everything's going to be okay. I believe that it is those periods of life. For myself, it was probably, I don't know, probably lockdown until the middle of last year. Well, like, things were going okay, right? I was fairly happy, I was making enough money, the business was growing, the podcast was going okay. And so on a day-to-day basis, I would wake up every day and feel really good. I'm like, shit, things are okay, this is good. Nothing's gone too badly wrong. There haven't been any huge highs, but there haven't been any really low lows. But then when I zoom out over that period of time, where for not one day did I wake up and think, oh, things are really bad or things are really great, I basically made no progress in life, right? The business grew, sure, but not really. Like, it didn't grow to any great extent. We certainly weren't taking on the international clients and doing the big consultancy projects. I mean, the podcast was getting listeners, but it wasn't really gaining listeners. My personal finances weren't really changing. I got like so skinny fat. Like, I think Billy can appreciate this. My body fat percentage was like 31%, and I'm skinny as fuck. Like, it was crazy. So like, the problem was I wasn't progressing because I wasn't being called to progress, right? And it's a really easy one for me to say, not least because it's so easy for you to disassociate from this idea and assume that you're not in this boat right now if you are. But if things feel a little bit too okay, a little bit too easy, a little bit too comfortable right now, I think now is the time for you to realign things and to make sure that in a year or 2 years' time, you don't zoom out and realize that you've wasted 1 or 2 years. Because when things are comfortable, it's easy to be comfortable. And I'm not saying like go and jump in an ice bath and then watch some Wim Hof and like punch yourself in the abs and get hyped up. I'm just saying, like, don't take your eye off the ball. Don't assume that the good times will always stay good, because if you do, one day you wake up and you realize that you've wasted 2 or 3 years of your life. The danger zone is in the middle. Now this one's interesting, because if you saw me rushing about a moment ago before we started, is because I decided on the short drive here to completely change one of the lessons to an idea that I've been thinking about a lot recently. Now the slide, if you can't read, it says, "A week isn't real," which sounds like nonsense and abstract, but I've done some research, I promise. Now I look at people, and I'm guilty of this as well, right? It's like you have the best intentions to transform your life, or to go and do that thing, or to make X number of sales calls, whatever it might be. And you get to Tuesday, and it's 2 p.m., and you're, oh shit, I've eaten that donut, which means my diet's ruined, or I haven't made the calls, or I haven't gone to the gym, or whatever it is. And so rather than just picking yourself up and beginning again, as we all do, as is basic human nature, we're like, oh, I'll start again on Monday. And I've just accepted that as conventional wisdom for the past 28 years until like a day ago when this popped into my mind and I'm like, shit, I need to write this down somewhere. I'm like, I wonder where a week comes from. So I did some Googling like a minute ago. So a week really is as conceptual as I thought it was, right? So this preview of this search result, our use of the 7-day week can be traced back to the astronomically gifted Babylonians and the decree of King Sargon I of Akkad around 2300 BC, right? So if I say to you, I've eaten a donut, so for the next 6 days, I'm gonna ruin my diet because then it's Monday. You'll be like, yeah, it kind of makes sense. I've heard someone say that before. If I'm like, I've eaten a donut, so for the next 6 days, I'm gonna ruin my diet because the Babylonians in 2300 BC, like, you'd be like, you've lost your fucking mind. What are you on about, right? And the more I look at it, the more I realize that I fall into this trap at least once a week. That's the crazy thing, because sure, it's not always diet, sure, it's not always sales emails, it's not always remaining consistent with the sleep and wake time, but at some point in each of my weeks, every week for the entirety of my life, I have said, oh, I'll just do it again on Monday. And then, thankfully, I haven't done it, because I feel like I would fall into a pit of depression if I did. But if you were to add up all of the days that you've lost in your life when you could be making progress because you waited from Wednesday until Monday, because you waited until from like, I don't know, Friday night until Monday, you added up all those days, you're probably losing 10, 15, 20 years of progress. And we don't have that long left, right? In our working lives, we're going to be lucky between each of us in here to probably have another, 25, 30. So we're losing crazy amounts of our life because we believe this idea that a week is real. And I appreciate this is quite abstract compared to the other lessons, but I just think it's an interesting idea to bear in mind. Next time you make that nonsense excuse to yourself that this can wait until Monday, as if Monday's even real. Not to get too abstract, but like, what is Monday, right? It's just this far away time that kind of delays the issue that you're currently grappling with until a future version of yourself who is going to be less well equipped to deal with it, because you're going to be 5 days in a calorie surplus, or 5 days without going for that run, or 5 days without replying to those emails. Like, you're just delaying the inevitable until some nonsense fictional time in the future that, spoiler, never comes. Because we're always saying we'll do it next week or next month or next year. And so I guess the takeaway of this idea, as abstract as it is in the way I presented it, is just that now is always the right answer when the question is, when should I do this thing that I need to do, right? Because at least in the 28 years of living that I've done so far, I have never been thankful for delaying something. I've never gained more clarity or insight or wisdom through ignoring a decision or avoiding action, because a week isn't real. And then the last one, and there are lots of stats that I talk about here that I will almost definitely butcher, but this is a nice idea to end on, I think, because almost a meta theme of everything I've shared is that it's so easy to assume that you're not doing as well as you could be, right? That there's always somebody doing better, that you're taking your eye off the ball, that you're not good enough, that whatever the other lessons were, right? But there's this really powerful idea that I open the book on, actually, which is that you're already above average. Because if you were to Google, like, what is the average X in the UK, and read the answer on everything from personal finance and the amount of debt that most people are crippled with for the best part of their adult life, whether it's the average BMI, whether it's, for example, only 14% of people in the UK even have a gym membership, right? So if you've been to the gym this year once, ever, congratulations, you're ahead of 84% of people. So like, I don't want to hear that you're not above average. If you drink enough water once in a week, ever, you're in the top 1% of people. Someone did, it was a water company, so I'm sure it was nonsense, but a water company did research of how many people actually hit the recommended daily intake of water per day, and it was like 0.94%. Now, I'm not saying that your life's going to transform if you drink more water, but the point is that it's so incredibly easy for us to assume that we are lesser than those around us, and as such, there's no point really trying, right? If you've read a book this month, congratulations, you're in the top 10%. Like, the stats are crazy, and I have a big list of them, because every time I'm doubting myself, or every time I'm assuming that I'm not the person who can go and do the thing I want to do, or that somebody's going to get there before me, or that I'm not qualified, or that they're better than me, or any excuse, I just need to remind myself, like, well done, I drank some water today. Because it's a nice, almost like an analogy for the fact that the average person, I hate saying this, it makes me sound like a dickhead, but I promise I mean this in the best way possible. The actual average person, if you like pull all the data and then build like an avatar of the average person, they're really struggling in life. And in many ways, like, some of my content is about this, right? Because I don't find any kind of humor in saying that, but like, the average person's life, if you actually look at it, even in the UK, like the 6th biggest economy in the world, is shit. Like, they're really struggling in so many ways. And rather than using that as a tool to look down on people and be like, oh, we're so good, look at us in this room, I think it's really powerful to realize that if you have just managed to get above average, even slightly, it tells you that you're doing something right, and it tells you that you are heading in the right path. And I don't need to tell anybody in this room that, rightly or wrongly, all of the upside in life, every single thing that you could ever want in life, is reserved for those who can be above average. Like, you've never Googled builder and then clicked on the one with like 2.5-star review and be like, yeah, I'll have Dave build my wall. Like, nobody does, right? But if somebody's slightly above average, you're like, yeah, I'll take a chance on them. If somebody's slightly above average, you tell your friend, right? I just had a haircut. I'm not sure how it looks. I haven't seen it yet, but the guy who cut my hair was lovely. I'll be telling anyone in Loughborough, like, that's the guy, right? And so, rather than looking at Instagram and reading these books and watching David Goggins shout at you and tell you to go for a 90-mile run in the morning, realize how low the bar is to actually be average, and then just hold yourself to such a standard that you're at least surpassing that bar every day, I think is really powerful, because I'm sure by the fact that you're all here, you're all already above average, and that means that all you need to do is keep going, and we will get the things we want. And that's it. Thank you very much.